Two, one. Welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb, and I'm here with a very special guest, Yujin Nagasawa. How are you doing?
Howdy, Tyler. It's Thank you for inviting me to your YouTube channel.
No, it's an honor. I've been a big fan of yours. Uh,
Thank you.
love reading a lot of your work, and in fact, I don't know if you remember this, Yujin, but um, when I first started to do, when I was looking to do a PhD, I had contacted you, and that's actually how we first made contact. Because I was
Yeah,
thinking about possibly coming there and being your student. I don't know if you
yeah,
recall that.
I don't remember that, but our times overlapped in the UK for several years,
Yes,
which
that's right.
and we saw each other in Edinburgh, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think I came and visited you in Birmingham because I think Joshua was one of your students then, and I'm friends with
All
Joshua.
right. Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
Craig was giving some lectures on God and abstract objects, I think. Yeah.
All right, right. Yeah, the Canterbury lecture series.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
Well,
So
very good to
now,
have you on.
yeah, it's nice to be on the same side of the pond with you
That's right.
again.
Yeah, and my wife is from Dallas, and so I'll go there from time to time. So next time I go,
Yes,
I'm gonna go up a little
yes.
further north.
You have to visit Norman.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, so I have a question for you, a little personal
Hmm.
before we get into the kind of more technical philosophical questions. And that
Sure.
is, how did you become a theist? If you identify as a theist, what kind of led you on that path?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in terms of religion, so I grew up in Japan, and Japan is a religiously rich country. So the country is mostly Buddhist, even though, if you ask the Japanese, most of them would say that they're not religious.
Mhm.
And also there is this indigenous religion, which is Shinto.
Mhm.
And in my family, my grandmother was a Catholic, and I went to a Presbyterian school for many years. So I attended a service every morning and read the Bible. So I have a big influence of Christianity. But I would say that I'm mainly a theist from a philosophical perspective. I think I'm really attracted to a theistic worldview. I'm not going to go through any specific arguments, but I think generally speaking, I find that the theistic view is more, um, it's better at explaining the world. I feel like naturalistic worldview is very unstable because it doesn't seem to explain the foundation of reality or the source of value and morality. And I feel like theism is more stable as a metaphysical view. So I think I'm mainly philosophically attracted to theism as a metaphysical position.
And then did the ontological argument play a role
Oh
in you?
yeah, so one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God is the ontological argument. And it's not a fashionable argument. There aren't many proponents even among theists, but I think it's a very powerful argument. I don't think it's a mathematical proof of the argument for the existence of God, but my favorite is the modal ontological argument, and it's clearly formally valid,
Mhm.
and the premises seem to be true, or at least they're plausible
Mhm.
premises.
Mhm.
And the conclusion is that there is God, or that than which no greater can be thought. So I think, I mean, there is a question about whether that than which no greater can be thought is an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being. But nevertheless, I think it's a great argument for something like God.
Yeah, you also wrote a book on this topic, specifically the maximal God and the
Yeah,
coherence,
that's right.
how all the
Yeah,
great
so
making properties fit together and that sort of thing.
I published a book titled Maximal God a few years ago, and there I defend the idea that the greatest possible being is the being that has the maximal consistent set of knowledge, power, and benevolence. And by appealing to this kind of concept of God, we can undercut many arguments against the existence of God, and also we can defend the modal ontological argument.
Very good, very good. Well, you got a new book
Mhm.
that just came out recently this summer
Mhm.
on the problem of evil, but kind of a spin on it. You talk about the problem of evil for the atheist and for the Buddhist as well. So can you tell me a little bit about what's the problem of evil for atheists?
Mhm.
And uh, yeah, kind of maybe talk a little bit about of like kind of the best sort of response that you can think of to
Sure,
the problem, and then how would you kind of respond to that?
sure. Yeah, I'm quite excited about this book. I haven't even received my own copy of the book, but it's an open access title, which means that you can download the whole book for free on Oxford University's website. So I hope many people will read the book. But this in this book, I argue that the problem of evil is a very deep problem because
Mm,
philosophers tend to assume that the problem of evil is just a problem for theists who believe that there is an all-powerful, all-loving God. Uh, so the traditional problem goes something like this. So, in this world, there are so many horrific things like crimes and natural disasters. And, if God is all powerful and all loving, how could God allow these horrific things? So therefore, people like Mackie, J.L. Mackie, the atheist philosopher, thought that this is a problem specifically for theists. But I say that the problem raises something deeper than that, and we can present different versions of the problem of evil, and some of them raise a challenge even for non-theists
mm,
or atheists. So by non-theists, I mean pantheists, panentheists, axiarchists, and so on, but also atheists as well. This argument, my main argument, has several steps. And the first step is that I introduce a version of the problem of evil for theists called the problem of systemic evil. So I focus on the system of natural selection and evolution. So we are biological existence, and our biological existence is dependent on evolution and natural selection. And I tend to think that this is a horrific system because it guarantees a competition for survival, and it necessitates pain and suffering for uncountably many organisms and sentient animals. Even if we are lucky people who have enjoyable lives without much suffering, our existence is dependent on the history of the biological world, which is filled with pain and suffering. And of course, this is a problem for theists, because again, theists believe that God is all powerful and all loving. So how could God introduce this kind of horrific system? And this problem seems to be very deep because we are not just talking about specific natural disasters or specific wars. These are just a contingent events, and most of them are uh, caused by humans. But I'm talking about this underlying system, which is beyond our control. And the second step is to expand the target of this argument so that it will raise a problem even for atheists. And my idea is like this. So the problem of evil for theists arises because theists have a specific axiological expectation.
mm,
So they believe that God created the world, therefore the world should be very good. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be very, very good because it was created by God. But if we look at the world, there are a lot of horrific things. Therefore, our axiological expectation doesn't match our
mm,
observation of the world. And this gap between expectation and reality creates the problem of evil. And atheists, I think many atheists are some kind of optimists. So they believe that overall and fundamentally, the world is good, or at least not bad. So they have a certain positive or non-negative axiological expectation. But again, if they look at the world, especially the system of natural selection and evolution, then it's guaranteed that the world is filled with pain and suffering. So I think there is an axiological expectation mismatch for atheistic optimists as well, and this is the problem of evil for atheists. And the final twist that I make is that okay, now the problem of evil, the problem of systemic evil, arises for both theists and atheists. So they have to respond to this problem. But when they respond, theists are more advantaged than atheists because theists have more resources than atheists, because atheists are typically naturalists. So they have only this material universe, this spatial-temporal universe, and that's all they have. But theists, they have a supernaturalist ontology, which subsumes the naturalist ontology, but it also includes other supernatural entities like God, the afterlife, and all kinds of things. So there are a lot of things that they can appeal to in attempt to resolve the problem of systemic evil.
So there's an axiological mismatch, typically with a lot of atheists who want to say, yeah, the world overall is good, or life is good, that sort of thing. However, the worldview maybe doesn't allow for that, and so it's kind of like, well, you gotta pick and choose. Are you gonna redo your axiological, value system, or are you gonna search elsewhere to make sense of your view of the world? Does that summarize roughly what you're saying?
Yeah, that's a nice way of presenting my core idea. So yeah, my view is that, okay, naturalists want to accept this naturalist ontology, but at the same time, many of them, or most of them, they would want to maintain optimism, which is a specific axiological view. But they seem to be in conflict. It's quite difficult for them. So in a way, I acknowledge that pessimistic naturalism is perfectly consistent. So they will say,
Right.
naturalism is true, the spatial temporal universe is all there is, and nature has turned out to be, quite horrible, and we just have to accept it. And that's a consistent view. But when you say the nature is all there is, which is full of pain and suffering, and it's nomologically guaranteed to be filled with pain and suffering, but at the same time, I want to think that nature or the world is overall good and fundamentally good, and that's quite difficult. And of course, it's difficult for theists as well, but theists are advantaged here because they can appeal to all kinds of supernaturalist ideas.
So what would be like the best sort of response that you're familiar with to your, like, outside of just going, you're right, I need to be a pessimist, not an optimist. What would be kind of the best sort of response that you're familiar with, and how would you respond to that?
So my view is that there is no compelling response to the problem of evil, both for atheists and theists. But I still think that theists are advantaged here, because if naturalists can develop a successful naturalistic response to the problem of evil, then theists can simply borrow that, because theistic ontology, again, subsumes atheistic ontology. While on the other hand, if theists can respond to the problem by appealing to supernaturalist resources, then atheists or naturalists, they cannot appeal to that. So theists can either, metaphorically speaking, theists can either win or draw, while atheists can only draw or lose.
Interesting.
So that's the structure, yeah. But I don't have any obvious response to the problem of evil.
Yeah.
It remains a significant challenge for me, both for theists and atheists.
And atheists, okay. Yeah, so the kind of the symmetry breaker, there's a symmetry breaker, but yeah, very good. So you also have a couple chapters which I really enjoyed as someone who does a bit of global philosophy, where you kind of apply this argument to the Buddhist tradition, Eastern traditions, I guess more generally, any sort of tradition that I guess that endorses the kind of impermanence thesis that Buddhism endorses, I guess would be largely your criticisms would be applicable to them as well. Can you kind of talk a little bit about how this version goes in reference to Buddhism?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad that you asked this question, because people tend to focus on just the chapter on the problem of evil for atheists in the Western framework, and they kind of set aside my final two chapters where I talk about the problem of evil for Eastern non-theists or atheists. But I think these chapters, for me, they are quite important because, you could say that, okay, maybe there is a problem of evil for theists in the Western framework, but people in the East, they live in a completely different tradition, so they don't need to worry about this. But I want to say that there is even a version of the problem of evil for the followers of Eastern traditions. And I focus on the Japanese traditions. I discuss some medieval Japanese texts where I think I can find a version of the problem of systemic evil.
Mm-hmm.
And this version, this specific version, is what I call the problem of impermanence. So here's the idea. In Buddhism, there are three kinds of suffering. The suffering, which is basically, pain and evil in almost like the Western sense. But they also talk about the suffering of existence and the suffering of impermanence. And the problem that I focus on is relevant to the suffering of impermanence. And there are a lot of medieval Japanese texts that talk about natural disasters. And when natural disasters take place, people are shocked because they encounter sudden deaths of people. And also, their houses are destroyed completely. And then, they wonder, why the world has to be like this. And I think this is a version of the problem of evil. And I say that there is an axiological expectation mismatch here as well, because ordinary people seems to assume that, things will be more or less okay, things will go on as normally, but sometimes suddenly there's a horrific event like an earthquake or tornado and so on, and they get shocked, and they are shocked precisely because there is a gap between their expectation and reality. And here, reality is suggested by Buddhist the Buddhist teaching, because according to Buddhism, impermanence is intrinsic to nature. So we cannot avoid impermanence. So that's why I say that this is a version of the problem of systemic evil. The world is systematically impermanent. It's not as if we can avoid impermanence, because this is the foundation of reality. So I say that when people encounter horrific events in the world, they suddenly realize that the Buddhist teaching was right in saying that everything is impermanent, our existence and the whole humanity as well. And that's the version of the problem of systemic evil for Buddhists mainly.
So on impermanence thesis, where everything is generally right, a momentary thesis is also affirmed, right, where everything from moment to moment is changing, and identity only lasts momentarily, right, and you have this kind of utter change that's constantly occurring, and we have like a desire for permanence, but doesn't meet the reality with how things actually are according to a momentary or impermanent thesis. And so this creates great pain and evil. And so if Buddhism says, hey, impermanence is a fundamental feature of reality, then you might think that life's gonna be full of suffering and change. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So the Buddhist metaphysics is very dynamic. So Kamono Chome, which is a medieval scholar that I discuss in the chapters, he says that the world and the life are like a river. It's constantly changing. It's almost like Heraclitus. You
That's
cannot
right.
step into the same river twice.
Exactly.
Everything is constantly changing. There's nothing permanent. But people naively often assume that things will be gone forever. All will be eventually okay. And then they get shocked when something disastrous happens.
So the average Buddhist off the street might think, yeah, sure, life is good. But then when they technically assume their worldview, when they think about their worldview for a moment, your point is actually, axiologically speaking, things aren't great and things won't be great. And so there's, again, this kind of mismatch. Is that right?
yeah. So I say, um, this impermanence of reality is consistent with Buddhism, but this problem still creates a puzzle or challenge for Buddhists as well. So that's why these Japanese Buddhist thinkers, they try to respond to the problem of impermanence. And I discuss 4 responses in the
What's
chapters.
your favorite response, and then can you briefly explain why you think that that response doesn't ultimately work?
Sure. So the 4 responses are Hermetism, indifferentism, hedonism, and supernaturalism, or transcendentalism, as I call it in those chapters. So Hermetism says that we should just stay away from civilization. We encounter horrific events and disasters because we live in a busy city and we are involved with so many different people. So we should just live in the mountains, and we should just read the novels and play musical instruments, and we can live peacefully. And that's quite nice, but I think that's a partial response. You can minimize the expectation mismatch, but you cannot completely fill the gap, because even if we can stay away from some of the disasters like earthquakes or fire or something like that. We are still impermanent. If Buddhism is right, our existence is impermanent by necessity. So this is only a partial response. Hedonism is an almost exact opposite to Hermetism. So hedonists would say that we are impermanent anyway, so let's drink alcoholic drinks and just try to enjoy ourselves as much as possible. And that's also kind of a nice way of trying to minimize the gap between expectation and reality. So the gap exists because we have a positive expectation and negative reality. So if we try to maximize our pleasure, then we can eliminate the gap a little bit. But again, I say this is a limited response because, again, we are intrinsically impermanent and we cannot avoid that. Indifferentism is almost like pessimism in the West. So indifferentists would say, just accept reality as it is. Reality is pretty harsh. Everything is impermanent. We cannot do anything. So we just accept it as it is. And then I say, yeah, just like pessimism, this is a consistent response to the problem. But it's not attractive because it's not the solution to the problem. I call it a no response.
Yeah.
We don't provide any positive response to the problem.
Right.
And my favorite is transcendentalism, which is a version of supernaturalism, which is the idea that we have to transcend our impermanent reality. So if you appeal to a Hindu approach, you might say that there is some kind of permanent reality beyond our existence. And if you appeal to a Buddhist approach, then you might think that there is no such thing as impermanent reality, but we can somehow still transcend our impermanence through some I don't know, meditation or some kind of through practice.
Yeah. Okay. And then you think that ultimately that one also doesn't work.
No, I think it's important to make sure. Okay, that's my transcendentalism is my favorite solution.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that it is correct.
Right.
What I'm saying that this is the only solution that is potentially successful.
Gotcha.
Because it it tries to show that we can overcome impermanence. But all other solutions, they cannot overcome impermanence.
They're in trouble.
It's solve the problem.
Great. Okay, well, let's close on this. What are you working on now?
At the moment, yeah, so this book has been just published and there'll be a book symposium on it. So I will have to work on it too. But also I'm exploring some new ideas, and I have written many papers on consciousness in the philosophy of mind. And some of the papers are related to issues in the philosophy of religion. So I might link some of them and write a book on God and consciousness. My first monograph was called God and Phenomenal Consciousness, which tries to bridge philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion. But yeah, I might want to revisit this kind of approach to different areas of philosophy.
That would be really interesting. That would be well. Thank you so much, Yujin, for coming on and sharing your work with us. And really recommend it for anyone out there. You can have open access to it. Just Google it and you go to OUP's website. You'll be able to read it. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Tyler. It was my pleasure.